the Monash Caulfield campus, which is based on the unceded lands of the Boonwurrung people. I just wanted to extend my acknowledgements and respects to elders past and present, and extend that to any First Nations persons that are joining us in this session. So today, Steve and I are presenting a quick snapshot of some research that we did, and we're calling the presentation Careers Information as an Ecology, Beyond a Narrow Focus on Formal Guidance and Advice. We can jump to the next slide. Oh, already there. Thanks, Steve. And so a bit of context for our research to begin with, I suppose. So this was, as I said, work conducted in 2021. I'll speak, I suppose, to the size and the methods of the data set that we have first off. So we had sort of three iterative elements in this research project, and we'll be talking a little bit about all of these and sharing some data from each one. The first is a kind of online social media and forum analysis of over 15,000 comments. And these were shared to some typical platforms like Reddit, but also some very Australian and youth-specific forums, such as Whirlpool and ATAR Notes. And as you'll see from the age groups that I'll talk to in a minute, there were certain reasons there for choosing those particular forums that allowed us to focus in on very specific discussions, and at the age groups of those having those discussions that we were interested in. Following that, we moved into doing focus groups, and we had 90 participants from all around Australia involved in those across the age ranges of 16 to 24. And that was divided up between the kind of underage cohort and the overage cohort, given that there were some sort of key points of difference that we wanted to tease out between those different groups, and obviously very different experiences based on age as well. We then finished up the work with the largest, I suppose, part as well, a nationally representative survey of 15 to 24-year-olds. We had over 1,100 responses to that. So across this presentation, we'll share qualitative data, which is quotes from our focus groups and from anonymous online sources, as well as some quantitative data from our survey. Can we go back, Steve? Sorry. I should also say too, the scope of the work, just to kind of outline what it is we were interested in here. The work was funded by the National Careers Institute, and we worked closely with them around these four kind of key areas. We wanted to capture a broad sense of experience of career services that young people engaged with. So that is what they do and also what they wanted from those different sources. We wanted to understand barriers and drivers, which include things like confidence and accessibility of different forms of service or advice. We wanted to tease out, as I mentioned, some differences between age cohorts. So looking at 15 to 18-year-olds who are in their final years of school, and then also 18 to 24-year-olds who have moved on perhaps to university and also transitioning into perhaps doing things like starting their own families. And specifically too, we were looking for data that could help us find ways to support the School Leavers Information Service specifically, which is a phone line service that's provided by the National Careers Institute. I should also mention before we get to our survey results later on that we have an interesting sort of measure that I wanted to just mention early on, and Steve can come back to that when he discusses some of the results. Given all of the things I mentioned there about the different age groups and the different points of life that people are at, it was a little bit difficult for us to deal with that diversity through typical understandings of things like socioeconomic status and measures like household income. Those started to kind of become a bit unclear and sort of lose meaning across this sort of age group. So we devised this sort of composite measure and a variable that we call parental support. And we'll speak to some results about that later on. But just quickly, it's a composite of 7 different items in our survey, which were financial support, emotional support, career and employment support, and then if relevant, help around the house, help with childcare, help with school, and also help in terms of receiving caregiving. And so our survey respondents would respond to this on a 5-point scale. And then that was then averaged to give us a score for each respondent between 1 and 5 in terms of a low to high level of parental support. But we'll talk more about that later on. So the key point that I wanted to tease out at the beginning of this is the main theme of our work is that the finding of an ecology. So we found that the myriad different services and resources that young people were drawing on to find out career information kind of jumbled together to form this kind of ecology, a kind of ecosystem of things that were broadly working together, but sometimes in conflict and competition. Primarily, we see the ecology as being relational, and that's a twofold reason that we use the term relational. So the first is fairly straightforward. It's like an A to B. So information is often found sort of sequentially. People might encounter careers information at one source, and then that informs where they then go to find it more about it at another source. The second component is related to communication. So we found as well as that information access was fundamentally networked. Young people relied on the support of other people. So this is peers, family and friends, and formal services at school and beyond to assist them in navigating different forms of career information. So they then pulled that ecology kind of together as a combination of resources and different channels to help make decisions about career and career-related activities. But as we'll get to now in the results, there's a lot of variety in how people access and use these different resources, and a lot of variation in terms of their confidence in the information that they would get. So this is types of sources that people accessed, preferences that they might have or whether one service or type of information was perceived as better than another. So I'll start to talk to some of those results now. So just as a very first off initial snapshot, this chart is a very simple just percentage representation of 11 different broad categories of service types that young people reported accessing via our survey responses. The responses here are obviously not mutually exclusive, hence the percentages adding up to more than 100. We can see broadly in the top sort of 4 or 5 categories, it is the human-based kind of communications that seem to be most utilised by young people to help them make decisions. So this was talking to parents, family and friends, talking to other students and talking to advisors. Online tools and face-to-face engagements with formal services tend to be less popular, and you can see them populating the lower sort of half of the list here. But perhaps more significant than this is to talk about the actual confidence that people had in those different types of sources. And this chart's a little bit more involved here, but you can broadly see the level of confidence ranging from not confident at all to very confident. And broadly, it matches the types of things that were accessed. Again, this sort of spoken, face-to-face, human communicative types of discussions had about careers were seen to be broadly better. Young people had more confidence that they would get useful information out of conversations. So this was most notably listening or talking to someone who was in a job that they might actually want, and then talking to parents and friends and those type of responses, again, also quite popular. Again, the services in the formal and informal sense, like something face-to-face or online, I see more mixed levels of confidence, as you can see further down the chart here. We think that these broadly speak to a sort of running theme, which is that young people want to get as close to a specific job or occupation as they can. They really wanted to get a sense of what a real job was like in a field that they were interested in. But I should caveat that it's hard to know if that's a norm or a preference. So terms like work experience or internships were used quite commonly by young people, but we don't really know if they actually think that that would be the best way to get information and experience, or whether they're just used to seeing that kind of discussion in the public sphere. So that's sort of an ongoing tension for us. Importantly, too, we should stress that this level of perceived confidence in certain resources doesn't actually speak to access. And so we'll come to that a little bit later on when I hand over to Steve. I just wanted to share some examples from focus groups as well. So we'll just quickly be talking to schools as the source of career advice, family and friends as the source of career advice, and then also anonymous peers online. But on this slide, I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to the kind of variability here. I won't read these quotes in their entirety, but if you're able to see the slides, you'll be able to read them as we go. On the left, we have quite a positive example, someone that had a really great experience in Victoria with their school-based careers counsellor. And then on the right-hand side, we can see that someone was a little bit more mixed in their response. They found that there wasn't a lot of detail in the school-based services that they were offered, and it tended to be seen as, if I put it optimistically, a kind of launching pad to then go and find out more information about a certain career pathway. So we have multiple other data points to this effect as well, related to the variability of school offerings between urban and regional examples, between public and private schools. But they're broadly only brought to the fore in focus group discussions. They're not reflected in any significant types of responses in our survey data. But I think from the second quotation on the right-hand side of the slide here, you can see the start of what we're talking about in terms of this ecology being relational, where people will move from one type of source of information to another and start to kind of assemble their own types of information related to careers of interest. I'm going to pass over to Steve to continue talking about our findings now.
Thanks, Ben. So yeah, carrying on with the qualitative material. So as Ben's noted, basically, there's a very high degree of confidence in family and friends as a source of useful career information. Though, as per the last slide as well, when we get into the qualitative data, we're reminded that practice is that in practice these things are present as a very mixed experience, and that's particularly the case with regards to the translatable value of parental knowledge, which is quite differentially distributed, I guess. So what we're talking about here on this slide is, it's well established in the research literature. It's the kind of thing that many of you, if not all of you, will know about already. And this is the presence of, or lack of presence, or lack of access to social capital. So we're talking about not just the advice that family and friends might be able to give, but also what's bound up with that and how it can be mobilized. So the first comment that you can see on the slide here is the kind of classic who you know is what matters. This is what's in play. So this young man paints a really vivid picture of the relationship between what a durable network of institutionalized relationships can give you and can give him. So it's not just insights into a specific industry if and when he wants it, which is one thing that he kind of suggests, but also that these act as a resource to benefit him materially, like more materially, in fact, in the form of doing an internship at the firm of one of the professionals in his family network. And then if you compare that to the second and third quote, these eliminate, I guess, the outcomes of a more constrained social, a constrained set of social capital or constrained social network. So the first young person points to a range of people, so parents, friends, and parents of friends, who have all authored general ideas, general thoughts, and a thumbs up in terms of the importance of staying in school and getting a university degree, but nothing really specific. And then our third young person more overtly explains how they kind of have to go this alone. Their parents have no cultural capital that can be mobilized in relation to career planning or navigation. And then moving on to the next kind of part of the ecology that we were really super interested in is, so basically, despite the fact that the research literature confirms that information is kind of constituted and navigated collectively rather than individually, there is a surprising lack of discussion of peer support in online spaces. And it might be because it feels intuitive in some ways, but it also, we're not entirely sure, but we think it's something that's super valuable. So what's interesting is that in our survey, online forums to discuss careers was an activity that had among the lowest levels of confidence among all of the respondents in terms of thinking about whether it would deliver useful information. And yet at the same time, when you go in and observe what's happening in these spaces, what's being exchanged between those young people that are engaging in the spaces and how they're doing it, it really compels us to consider this as an untapped and largely unconsidered resource. The pool of communal knowledge and experience across a variety of platforms is in our estimation useful for understanding and navigating a whole raft of bureaucratic issues that we observe. So things like understanding ATAR and its implications, things like how to access job seeker, things like accessing, sharing stories of success and challenges in terms of linear but also non-linear career trajectories, insights into specific industries, and even definitely sizable evidence of calling out forms of workplace disrespect, of educating around labor market realities, and of sharing understandings and how to overcome, or at least move away from the experience of structural problems around gender and race, and kind of internalizing those as individual failings. So really kind of a sociological kind of analysis that's happening around, within, between young people. And that's not to say there isn't plenty of advice that emphasizes hard work and self-responsibility. Like, those things are there 100%. But the collective is an important issue to stress here, because it goes against the grain of lots of positioning of young people as self-interested, kind of purely entrepreneurial selves. And what we're pointing to here is an undeniable collaborative action in process. And the quote on the bottom of the slide is just one of many, many examples where someone's launching into a quite generic question in some ways, an open question, trying to get a sense of what this young person might and should or could do. And the kinds of responses that fall out of that are rich and diverse and particularly interesting. So we want to stress, though, that throughout the data, there is clear evidence of inequality of access to and confidence in different parts of the ecology. And these inequalities, they play out along familiar lines such as parental support, gender, location, and whether or not one is identifies as First Nations or not. And although they're familiar, they're always worth repeating, I think. So especially because it comes through very strongly in the literature these days, but educators and social justice focused careers guidance practitioners set about trying to explicitly acknowledge and attending to those group differences in order to undermine oppression. So here's some of the things that we found in that respect. In this figure, we're showing the 3 most commonly undertaken careers advice activities and the differences in relation to parental support, gender, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander status or not, and only where these are, well, most of them where they're statistically significant. So what we can see in this figure is that parental support is a consistent predictor of careers advice seeking across all these 3 top types of activity. And it's the only measure that showed a statistically significant difference for talking to a careers advisor or practitioner. This is somewhat surprising. And basically, again, it's familiar, but worth restating. Those with low parental support, in the way that Ben described at the beginning, are less likely to have ever done so, to have ever engaged with a career practitioner, compared to those who scored a high parental support score. And then when we look at talking to parents or other family members, this gap is even more striking. So I'm just drawing your attention to the red and blue lines on the second measure, where the high parental support score is dramatically higher than the blue line, the low parental support score, in terms of talking to parents or family members. And then there are some interesting gender issues here as well, because our data for the most part indicates that men are less likely to engage in these types of activities than women, but there's an inherent tension here because recent research led by our colleagues at Monash, including Joe Gleason and a bunch of other colleagues, they found that over half of young women did not believe that their family, friends, cultural background would help them achieve their career choices. So there's a tension here that's interesting, that young women might do these things, but are they effective or not? We're not entirely sure. And then we're coming to a close fairly soon, but looking at the next 12 months and the prospect of engaging with careers advice of any sort, a whole bunch of social inequalities are present. So this graph shows the distribution of the levels of agreement with this statement about whether or not one would be likely to engage with careers advice. And again, what we see is familiar fault lines. So those from rural areas, less likely to agree than those from urban areas, those with low parental support, less likely to agree than those with high parental support, and those who identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander are also less likely to agree. And also just a note, you'll see in the second kind of block of columns, this is about at school or post-school status. And in a way, that's an artifact of the study design, but it is also interesting that the school years are an important time for when we can engage young people, but or perhaps we should also be thinking after they've left school, what can we do to engage young people more so, given the kind of direction of travel of lifelong learning and portfolio careers and non-linear career choices. So just lastly, I'm going to say some things on this slide before we hand back over to Lizzie. So to conclude, what we're kind of offering here is a series of points that are points of interest or that might be provocations in a way. So we want to kind of rest on this idea that young people do a lot more than consult formal guidance services. Again, it's intuitive, but we think it's really worth framing as an important point of acknowledging as an important point of practice for young people themselves. So they consult multiple sources. It's all part of this complex relational web, and too often this goes missing. And one of the kind of key conclusions we draw here, or suggestions actually, is that we wonder whether all evaluations of specific programs and practices and interventions would do better to include this kind of consideration, so we can get a more nuanced but more complete understanding of the knock-on effect of establishing some success in one area of the ecology, and then how that translates into using other parts of the ecology or not. And then it leaves us with a bunch of questions, I guess. So just finally, to the last couple of points on the slide, what can we do to consolidate the value and scope of career guidance counselling? And how, and critically, I think, based on some of the points we've raised today, but also what we raised in the paper, how might we leverage peer support and see this as an anonymous peer support as well, and see this as useful for young people and see young people as a resource themselves? And I think paying attention to what goes on online, we think, is a natural extension of these considerations of families and communities as productive and enabling structures, and careers guidance counsellors as well. And we really want to stress that what we see here is active assistance, which shows a really embedded interactive process of co-constitution, and which undermines the idea that young people are necessarily purely rational, purely autonomous, kind of independent, self-determining neoliberal subjects. And then finally, just to reiterate again, the points around the injustices, the inequalities, we don't have solutions to that, but we know that access to industry is something that lots of young people talk about, but it's uneven in terms of geography, social capital, the various demographics that we've already described. So the question we kind of want to leave you with really is, how can social justice be enacted in supports, in services, and in different dimensions of the ecology?
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much, Steve. That was really, and Ben, that was great, and a really important kind of contribution. We've had some questions, some of which have been, and I hope you can see the claps floating through the air towards your way. But can I just ask you one question? If you were going to give practitioners one single message, and to me it sounds like considering peer support, but what would be your one message to practitioners to consider this research and to take it into the field? Just as a last tool, Ben.
That's a tough question. I think this will sound like I'm trying to get around the question, but the answer is actually to take it seriously. And I think there is a tension between, in lots of professions, imagining that someone else might have the answer that we ourselves are trying to give to young people. So if we situate ourselves as part of the ecology framework, then we kind of develop a better understanding that we're one cog in the machine of many. And I think, recognizing that tension between, lots of young people think online information is potentially, they're not confident in it necessarily, but then when you go and see it in action, and I think I would ask the same of practitioners as well, to really think about kind of reconceptualizing online spaces as productive spaces, not just for information, but for also doing the type of social justice work that we want to do ourselves. So, that we are part of that collaboration with young people in a variety of different formats, and that doesn't have to be seen as a competition, but part of the collective whole that can achieve better outcomes. I don't know, Ben, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's really productive. But as you say, it's a tricky space because obviously we would want to recognise that. I would maybe speak to comments that were made early on in the session from Maya. Just knowing that Maya is working at the same institution we do. Obviously some of the online fora we speak about here can very clearly be a source of competition and maybe a site of knowledge that is not up to date or not correct, especially when there are really firm points of guidance to be had around some of the systems we have, things like ATAR that are very clear, and some of those things could potentially be a distraction too. But yeah, I definitely think there's so much value in that online kind of space and the support from peers. Yeah.
No, that's brilliant. And it reminds me as well, so that idea of valuing hot knowledge, the Stephen Ball stuff about, not taking seriously what people talk about. And there's a whole theme of kind of work about managing information is a key part of career development capacity. And do you think that resonate in your study as well, of kind of that people having trouble managing, valuing, evaluating information?
Yeah. It's a great question. Definitely evaluating, because that people often see there's a huge supply of information. And one of the things that was interesting, so what we didn't talk about today was kind of one of the motivating factors for this research was a particular tool that the National Careers Institute developed, the School Leavers Information Service. And if you take that as your starting point in terms of evaluating that actual tool, young people are quite suspicious of that. So and I guess the point is not to downplay the significance of that tool, but to get at a sense of how you cut through all of the information is really tricky. And young people voice that concern themselves. They know there's a lot of material. They know there's stuff on LinkedIn, there's stuff everywhere. And they basically said stuff that doesn't make the first page or two on Google is never going to reach them. So there's an oversupply of information, but then a sense of how do you evaluate, how do you cut through, how do you access the right information? And I think what's interesting about that is that it fairly much covers the board as well. It's not necessarily patterned by social inequalities, although there are trust issues as well around that are marked by inequalities. But yeah, there's a mixed kind of reaction to how to evaluate and information overload and what's a legitimate source and so on.
And it becomes a filtering process too. I was just going to add, sorry. Yeah. I think turning online and finding out a real answer from someone who is perhaps 1 or 2 years older than you. We saw some really lovely sort of stories where someone would go in and say, I want to crack into this industry, I'm passionate about it. And you would get a response from someone who'd, gone through that experience a couple of years ago and replied in a few comments. And so, yeah, it becomes a filtering strategy, rather than going through, as Steve said, pages of information and getting tired out quite quickly at the volume, or even trying your best sometimes to follow what to be formal services through, say, a government resource, and finding things like dead links when departments have changed and things like that. It is easier to see if you can find a pathway through someone else's experience.
That's brilliant. Well, that's all we have time for, but it's been a really nourishing lunchtime. So thanks so much. And this has been the highest registration for the week. So lots of interest in this research, and we've sent the link to everyone. And we hope you'll stay in touch, and we can't wait to see how this develops.
Thanks, Lizzie.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everybody.